Hi, welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and my co-host is Chris Lucian. And today we are very excited to have JB Rainsberger with us. And it's a real pleasure for me because I've been following his videos and contents for a while in the kind of the test-driven development world and been learning a lot from him. And it's also fun to have him on to talk about mobbing. So we got some good topics lined up. So we got N greater than 2 programming, early mobbing, so to speak. We got mobbing in isolation, or mob programming versus programming solo or in isolation, time boxing or letting it flow. And then also, what is the state of mob programming? Is it gaining steam? How did the pandemic help or not help with that? So I got some fun stuff to talk about. So before we get started, JB, do you mind giving us a little intro about yourself and how you've related to mob programming?
Not at all. So I used to live in Toronto and was one of the early members of the Extreme Programming Toronto user group out there, which is actually where I first started to connect with people who are interested in pair programming, and then in what we started to call, N greater than 1 programming, which is why stop at 2, which was a thing that we got to talk about, but never really got to do. And so I spent a few years, I began my career at IBM in Toronto. Great place to learn. The biggest mistake you could possibly make would cost you your job, but you wouldn't take anybody's livelihood with you. But I started to really get the feeling like the kinds of things that I was interested in doing meant that my prospects at IBM were a bit limited. So I left at the height of the tech bubble to become independent, which, in retrospect, maybe wasn't the wisest course of action, but it worked out. And so next month will be 19 years working as an independent consultant, coach, contractor, trainer. I've called myself a few things over the years, employment addiction counselor. Now, these days, I like to call myself an Agile coach, but actually Agile and actually a coach. And so, when we don't have a global travel disruption, I spend about 3 months a year in Central Europe, wandering around, teaching people evolutionary design, test-driven development, more general, lightweight software development stuff, and just hoping to be there at the moment when they feel when they feel hope for the first time in a long time about their prospects for how their projects are going to go. And mob programming seems like one of those things that we were talking about a long time ago, but because I wasn't at the right place at the right time, I wasn't the reason why people started doing it. Yeah, no bitterness, but it kind of would be nice to be one of the reasons why something became popular and not just have to sit there saying, I was doing this back before it was cool, which is a little bit true, but that's how it goes. I'm not a marketing genius. That's why I'm here.
Well, I guess before we jump into some of the topics we had, I'm interested to learn a little bit about those early times, right? I think, Chris, we've had a couple of people say like, oh yeah, I kind of did something like mobbing before mobbing was a thing. What was your experience exactly? Like, did you try it, or is it just talk about it, or what was your experience exactly? Yeah.
Well, so I was fortunate that I got to learn about extreme programming from the pioneers. And so pair programming was one of the core practices in extreme programming, which I got to try a lot. And, there were sort of some of the standard variations, ping pong programming, evil pairing, which was the whole, I write a test and then you make it pass in the stupidest possible way. And then you write a test and I make it pass in the stupidest possible way. And the whole idea there is to sort of force each other to refactor only when it was very clear that it needed to be done. And that was a way to sort of help learn a little bit of the limits of refactoring. Like, how much can you really push the design decisions to the last responsible moment? How much do you need to know upfront about when to make good design decisions? And one of the things that we experimented with, because we had no idea what we were doing, we called it carousel programming. So imagine 3 people in a triangle on wheelie chairs, back when that was actually unusual in offices. And the first person would write a test, and the next person would make it pass. And then the second person would write a test, and the third person would make it pass. and you would pass control that way. We called it carousel programming because you would wheel the chairs around the computer. Back then the computers were stationary and the programmers were mobile. So you would literally make this little carousel of 3 people moving around to where the computer was on the desk. And that was how we what you would say today mobbed. Although really it wasn't very much of a mob since it was 3 people. So that was one experience that I had. That was kind of a way for the handful of people in the office who had some interest in pair programming to have the experience of pair programming, and to just let's experiment with what it's like to have 3 people. And then at a conference, I had a wonderful experience where Ward Cunningham and Elizabeth Hendrickson were just sitting there pairing on something. And so I walked up behind them, sat down, just sort of said hello. Hey, what are you folks working on? And after a while, a strange, totally spontaneous dynamic happened where Ward would start typing and Elizabeth and I would talk about, like, how would we test this? What are we looking for? I would ask her questions about what kinds of things are you looking for? What are you thinking about? What heuristics are running through your mind? And then a little time would go by, and then Elizabeth would start exploring something about what Ward had just built. And then Ward and I would talk about the design, or would talk about code he had just written. What direction is he going? What is he thinking? And so it wasn't really mobbing, but it was more of this idea of sort of 2 simultaneous pairs where the third person, me, was sort of part-time programming and part-time testing, and just naturally flipping back and forth within the 2 pairs, which was kind of an interesting experience. Not something that I think I've ever actually tried again, but again, just it's kind of nice to think that sort of the generalizing specialist can sit down even while a pair are working, and by being sort of at least minimally competent in both disciplines, to be able to flip back and forth between pairing with one person and pairing with the other person on strategy. And then, they can be actually trying to do stuff at the keyboard, and I would just flip back to the other person and then flip back. So that was kind of an interesting experience. So I never really had the sort of mobbing experience the way we think of it today, where you have half a dozen people, very multidisciplinary group, intentionally swarming on a single task and not trying to worry about having multiple streams of parallel work or any of that kind of stuff, not worrying about efficiency in that sense or resource utilization, but just swarming, because that's what we called it back then, with just swarming. If you limited the group to a single story, task, feature, whatever you wanted to call it at a time, then by virtue of the fact that there were 5 or 6 or 7 people in the group, they would have to swarm. In the worst case, they would come together for a little bit of time, figure out how to divide the work into 2 pieces, do it individually, and then come back 2 or 3 hours later, have meetings 2 or 3 times a day, where they would literally just 4 people would sit in front of the machine if it was a complicated enough task, and just do it all together. And maybe one person is there mostly to learn, one person is there mostly to supervise, and the other 2 are the traditional pair. Those were sort of my early experiences. And what I got from all that was sort of the idea that pairing, trios, group, mob, whatever you called it, didn't matter. All that was really interesting was n greater than 1. Like, could it scale up to a bigger group? Is there any reason why that wouldn't be the case? What would the roles be like? What would people do? And we just didn't worry about it. We just sort of let it happen and experimented with it. The sad thing is that mostly happened in conferences and user group meetings, not in situations where we got paid, because of course all the sponsors would see is I'm paying 4 times as much for the same results, and why would I do that? And I can't blame them. I think the one real problem we always had with this stuff early on was that I never had a good answer for why the hell would I pay 4 times as much, 5 times as much to get the same amount of work done? And I never had a good answer for that. So that mobbing always seemed to be something that we did in our free time as a hobby. and not something, at a code retreat or whatever, and not something that we would ever do for money. And I can't account for why it is in the last 5 years that some sponsors have started to see the wisdom of this and have agreed to start paying for it. Because I don't know about you, I haven't seen any studies. I haven't seen any papers with convincing looking curves or, models that show me how effective this is. It really does seem to just be our word against theirs. And like anything else in our industry, if somebody agrees to pay for us to use an experimental practice, it's not because of anything we said. It's because their experience has shown them that this could be of value, and they had that opinion before we even entered the room. Either that, or it boils down to absolute crisis point, and now we really do need to have 4 people working on this at once, because what else have we got to lose?
I mean, yeah. So I talk about this. I was at Scrum Gathering in Japan, and I did the keynote. My keynote there was the idea that if you're always in an emergency, you never wait for an emergency to cause you to try something new or experiment or run your own experiment, right? Lots of companies out there do this thing where they only trust the studies that come out, and they don't have any process of experimentation. And if no one is looking at any studies, then they just stagnate. Everything is too dangerous to move on to, right?
Right.
And so I think 2 things really caught my ear in your description of what had happened in the past. One was, we had recently, before we started mobbing, we had recently gone to a conference, and we were doing essentially code katas and rotating at the keyboard in the conference way. And we were in the middle of an emergency where a project was due and would obviously not get out on time unless we really got together and thought about what we could be doing differently. And so the inception of mobbing was kind of both those things. It was an emergency, and it was recent conferences and learning session time, practice time, or whatever. But and then, as far as the convincing advice goes, so we've been doing this for the last 9 years now, and so a lot of it has been anecdotal in nature. But what the company sees is that prior to this point it was impossible to deliver, and then after this point it's almost been guaranteed that we deliver, right?
The nice thing about Anecdotes is that I don't know how anybody else feels, but for me, generally speaking, I only care about what works for me.
Yeah.
And if I'm a sponsor of a project, I only care what works for the project. I don't need it to work for everybody else. I just need it to work for us here now.
Yeah.
And so, whenever I hear someone say, oh, well, that's just an anecdote, or, that's just one person's experience. Well, I'm not investing in everybody else. I'm investing in me. I care about my performance, or our collective performance here and now. And whatever anybody else does is just a source of ideas of things to try. Treating it as anything more than that, I think the pendulum swings in the other direction towards this absurd false confidence that if we just do what they do, then we'll inherit their successes. I mean, that's the other thing that we've spent a good half century relearning, is that just doing what other people do doesn't confer their successes onto us.
Context,
there's usually something missing. And absolutely.
So I think we should ask, what is it like going for you, going from a mobbing environment to a solo environment, or vice versa? And what can you compare and contrast the two? Because it sounds like you're doing it more often now, than back then. Now that it's not only a conference thing, I think, what's life like going back and forth between the two?
Well, so most of the mobbing that I do these days is in training courses, right? So I do, if I'm training a group in evolutionary design, test-driven development, whatever, it's one of the most common things that people ask me for. And so, we'll have some combination of individual pair practice, and if the group is small enough, and especially if it's the kind of training where it's one or two teams as opposed to a smattering of 25 people from across the company, then I'll really encourage them to do some form of mobbing. I'm actually creating an intentional bottleneck at that point, because I do want people to see what other people are learning in the course rather than just having 20% of the group really take off, 20% of the group founder, and the other 60% sort of tread water. And so that's where I tend to do most of my mobbing these days. And so it's a bit of an artificial environment because on the one hand, they're trying something new, or they're trying something that at a minimum they've not done together before. Maybe one or two people have been doing some form of evolutionary design in their daily work, but they've maybe been secretive about it, or, you know, in the best case, it's a group that has been trying to do it and has hit the first few big obstacles in their path, and now they need someone to help them get over it. When I then tried to write code on my own, I just don't enjoy it as much as I did. And I think it really boils down to the feeling of getting stuck and not having someone to turn to in real time and ask a question. I think that more than anything else, that has soured me on programming on my own. Just because the best I can hope for is that I reach a roadblock, I formulate a decent question, I maybe spend a little more time than I need to sort of proving that it's not just me making a stupid mistake, that it really is something I don't know that I don't know, or whatever it is. And then figuring out which of the 7.347 million online communities to ask a question. It was much easier 20 years ago when you went to the extreme programming Yahoo group, or the refactoring Yahoo group, or the test-driven development Yahoo group, or even the JUnit Yahoo group. And the 150 most active members of the worldwide community are there. There's a good chance that you're going to get into a conversation with 6 of them that'll last 2 weeks. You'll get a fantastic answer to your question, and you get unstuck. And you learn like 12 things that you didn't expect to learn. These days now, Quora, Stack Overflow, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever, there's so many places to ask questions. There are so many more people who are eager to answer, who are perhaps well-intentioned but a little naive. You don't know whom to trust. You don't know who has the experience. And so then there's still the customer service representative problem of, I want to be shown answering your question. So I'm going to answer a question, whether it was the question you asked or not, because I'm getting judged by the world on being seen answering a question. So it's harder now. It's harder now to get unstuck when you're stuck. And, you know, combine that with a bit of a malaise and frustration with just how horrible everything is and how nothing really seems to work. Everything is broken. Nobody seems to mind. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence to go out and try to learn new technologies. The closest I've come in the last couple of years is 2 years ago, I stumbled onto Elm and I started just poking around and trying to build some small things.
Yeah.
And I kind of liked this sort of gentle on-ramp to strongly typed functional programming environment, but where I could still create a single page web app. It's something familiar. I can get something up and running quickly that makes me feel good. That helped me overcome some of the inertia that I feel in trying to program on my own.
Yeah.
But even then, I mean, eventually, once you get past the honeymoon period and you've learned, you've learned the first 37 parts of this shiny new thing, and now it's more about trying to just build something than it is about, being able to go into a brand new world. I have to say that it's a little bit harder for me to sit down, even in Elm, and feel energy to build something that's just a hobby project for me. Like if I don't have some kind of external motivation to build something, like I'm doing a volunteer project for for an organization I volunteer for, or if someone's stupid enough to pay me to build something in Elm, then I would have that reason to, charge out of bed and sit down at the computer and do it. But otherwise, it's just, the fun part of the learning is over. Now it's just details and it's boring. So I have to figure out the next new thing. If I have a pair, at least, I can borrow their motivation. I can borrow their energy. I have this feeling like it's not all on my shoulders to deal with how stupid, AWS API gateway is, or whatever stupid technology thing I'm dealing with at the moment. This isn't what I signed up for. I just wanted to write some nice, referentially transparent functions in a programming language that with error messages that hug me. Can't I just do that?
Yeah,
and it's much easier to feel resilient when there's somebody beside you.
So there are a few things in there. I think mobbing is like an intensely social thing, and also I think what I noticed, kind of to your first point, when developing by myself, I would realize like I'd get stuck and then I'd get frustrated. Usually it's like 1 or 2 a.m. when this happens to me, and I'm just like, oh, I'm gonna like worry about it. And then like in the middle of a shower, I'll be like, I know what to do now, and then I come back, right? Like, and with mobbing, like that experience of like having to wait till the next day to have my brain like fall properly into place is almost entirely gone. And so
right, because you get a break.
Yeah.
You want to fade into the background for 20, 30 minutes and let system one do some work? You can. That was the first thing that really attracted me to pair programming, was not so much the truck number thing, not any of that stuff. It was I can fade out for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And, the odds are pretty good that my pair partner is not going to get into huge trouble in 2 minutes. And just take like a little mental break and then come back, ask a couple of questions, be back where we are, and maybe system one has done some work. And when I'm in a larger group, that 2 minutes can be 10 minutes, and that's okay. And I know that sounds a little bit like it contradicts the thing I said earlier about sponsors and paying N times as much. And don't get the wrong idea. We vastly underestimate the value of letting it all go and letting system one do its job and then come back to it later. And why should we have to wait until the next morning in the shower or the next afternoon when we go out for a walk? Why can't that be in 30 minutes or in 20 minutes where I can get up, walk away, grab coffee, come back, the mob is going, I can take a look and see sort of, okay, what do I have to catch up on that's happened while I was out of the room? Cool, I get it. Aha, now I have a great idea. It seems to me that I would rather have that in 30 minutes than in, 8 to 17 hours.
Yeah. I mean, that's
very hard to put in a spreadsheet.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. But the value proposition is going to be in that story. But it's really hard to quantify the amount of time it took to think of an algorithm that you did not have complete information about beforehand. Right. And so I totally agree with that. And I think one thing that made it work for us a lot is again, it was that emergency, right? And how does a company get to the point where they don't need that emergency to give them the kick in the pants to try new things? And so,
that's such a big open question. I have no idea. Right? Nobody can afford to do it well, but everybody can afford to do it again. Unfortunately, one of the explanations for that is that many of these companies just have too much money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They can afford to not do it well. And it's sad to think of it that way. I don't want that to come across as glib or insensitive. But I mean, one of the dark side of Slack is that if you have too much, then it's easy to get lazy. Maybe that's okay, but that might not be what you want. If you want someone to see the value of doing things differently than the way they're doing it, and yet they have all this money and time slack, then, that's, that used to be something that felt like a problem that needed to be solved. And now I see it more as just, it's a situation. It's the way it is. If there's one person who has intrinsic interest and motivation in learning this stuff, I'll start with them. And I'm happy if it's just the two of us for however long until a third person decides, hey, I'm interested in this too. Everyone's invited.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me on this question, before we jump to the next one, is I think for me, I've been at multiple organizations, and again, it's not based on a study or like hard data, but just experiencing different organizations not mobbing and mobbing, and just seeing how incredibly more efficient things get done and how continuous delivery really happens and how value really happens. And then I look back at the old way. And I think after mobbing for a while, to answer your question, like the feeling difference between two, I feel like, and this is maybe a positive interpretation of my intuition, but maybe rosy colored, but is that I feel like I have like an emotional reaction to waste now, where before I was much more tolerant of it. So if I'm
I feel you.
Yeah. But when I was programming alone before, it's just like, that's the way you do it. You program alone, and you kind of feel, you kind of live in that world where you feel like everything I'm writing is going to be kept and everyone's going to love it. And the code review is going to go great. And there's going to be no bugs. And then the code review happens and it's like this huge discussion. But instead of having the discussion in flow, it's like, we're talking about code I wrote 4 days ago. Right. And so now after mobbing for a while, getting that feedback real time, you see the efficiency of like, oh my gosh, I got that feedback now, and we fix it now and we move on now. There's no rework, right? And so as soon as I start coding alone, after about a half an hour, I get this gut feeling like, oh, something's wrong. I'm making something I'm like working in a dark corner here, and and as soon as someone else looks at it, they're going to see some problem, right? Or some issue. But the way we're going to discover it is going to be way slower than if they were just here with me right now, And so,
yeah. So there's two things that come out of my mind. One of them is that I talk a lot about, how do we change the way we work? Like what things should we start with? Well, find a feedback loop that's too long and cut it in half. And the idea of cutting it in half is usually enough that it forces you to change something important about the way you work, but it's not an insurmountable challenge, right? So whether you do it as systematically as mapping value streams or whether you just take a very intuitive view of it, just look for places where it looks like a feedback loop is very long, annoyingly long, intolerably long, unacceptably long. Just try cutting it in half. You'll be forced to change one or two important things about the way you work, let the system adapt, and then try again. And the nice thing about that is that at that point, I don't care whether you're interested in lean, agile, Scrum, Kanban, FDD, DSDM, extreme programming. None of that stuff matters. All that matters is a basic idea from theory of constraints. You have a long feedback loop. Those situations where when somebody tells you that was wrong, your first instinct is to get angry instead of be thankful, right? Yeah. We want our feedback loops to be short enough so that your first reaction to that feedback is gratitude instead of annoyance. That's a simple heuristic that anybody can use to identify areas where the feedback cycles in their life are too long. And part of what I hear in your description there is an example of the difference between a feedback cycle that's too long, that by the time we get the feedback, there's no point in having it. Where were you 4 days ago? Compared to being able to get it at the moment when you don't just have an opportunity to do something with it, but you feel happy to do something with it. I mean, there's such a huge emotional shift in there that people drastically underestimate. And actually, it relates to something that I think probably people can relate to if they live in a big enough place. And that is, if you're sitting in traffic, I don't drive, but I have rode in cars in my life. You sit in traffic and the trip is supposed to take about an hour, and 20 minutes of that is sitting in traffic, mostly stopped on a highway somewhere. And the hilarious thing is that most people feel worse if they spend 20 minutes stuck in traffic in a 1 hour trip than if they go slow the whole way for an hour and 15 minutes. And I don't understand that. That's just a bug in the human brain that, like, you got there sooner, but because you spent 20 minutes not moving, you spent 19 minutes and 43 seconds whining about not moving, and then 40 minutes moving at a higher speed. You got there sooner, and yet you are more annoyed than you would be if you had gone slowly, mostly steadily, and got there in an hour and 15 minutes. And that's a thing that I think most people will have experienced that once in their life. And that could be one of those little stories that helps someone get the cognitive distortions that cause them to underestimate the value of that flow, the value of being able to get those questions answered, rather than, say, working on your own, away from the rest of the group, piling up unanswered questions, having all these open loops to manage, and then asking those questions in a batch, and then waiting for an answer for 2 or 3 hours, that even if by chance that were more efficient, it would feel a lot worse. And so the hilarious thing is us working together, feeling like we're not going very fast, somehow we end up getting there sooner, because every question we ask gets answered as quickly as it possibly can. And only if the collective wisdom of the group isn't enough do we then need 1 or 2 people to go away, do some research, come back and answer a question. And in the meantime, nothing stopped. I think if one thing that, an exercise like mapping the value stream does is help people see that so much of the waste is in work waiting for the next person. And when they see just how much waiting there is, maybe they will understand that the apparent extra cost of 4 or 5 people working on the same task at once, that's totally overshadowed by you waiting 3 days for Chris to answer a question, Chris waiting 4 days for me to answer a question, and then all we're doing is just delay. So maybe this could be one of those little stories that helps people develop an intuitive understanding for how this can be, how having me be available to answer your questions that quickly could be a better investment than each of us going to our respective corners and then waiting an average of 3 days for each of us to have the time and energy to answer each other's questions.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean,
I just wish it wasn't the kind of thing that people had to experience to understand. I wish they could appreciate the value of it more even before they experience it.
Yeah.
Because I've never met anyone who, so far I've only met one person who really didn't like programming in a group once they got started. There was one person who just had such severe anxiety about performing in front of other people that like his wife noticed a change in his personality before he did, and he had to stop. And that's fine. But most people, most of the time, I feel so much more supported when I'm with people who are trying to do the same thing as I am at the same time. I can't help but be able to bring more energy to the work when I feel supported like that. And when I program on my own, I feel like I'm on an island. I have to fend for myself. And all I have is the uncaring internet who might or might not answer my question. And whenever they get around to it, because they're volunteering to help me, and I have no idea how much I should spend to, rent people to help me. If I'm going to do that, then I would rent them to be doing the work with me in real time, not to just sort of be there to answer my emails whenever they feel like it.
Yeah. I think before changing topics, I think one thing that makes it hard is from a lean perspective, it's easier to see it in a factory, right? Where you have some waiting. And that's causing more inventory because they're waiting. So they're going to start doing something else. Yeah. Where with the software development cycle, it's all invisible, so to speak, unless someone makes it visible in some way, like a value stream map or something like that.
Exactly. Right? Much easier to fool yourself into believing that we're making progress when all we're doing is piling up inventory. It would be so much better if you could see the inventory piling up on the floor. Yeah. And I think that's the one thing that we really have missing is that you can't see. I mean, we don't even necessarily have enough people who agree that code is a liability, let alone being able to see inventory piling up in front of the next person in the approval chain or whoever is supposed to accept the PR or the architect or whatever.
Cool. Well, I think we'll transition in light of time. We still got 2 great topics, so we'll see what we can do. So strict time boxing versus letting it flow. What do you have in mind here? Well,
so a lot of people so I think it applies both in general to sort of, project groups having a cadence for delivery, but it's the same thing also for individuals and how they work. And I think that it's become especially fashionable, I think, in the last 5 years or so. Maybe it's just that I'm noticing it more. for people to poo-poo the idea of time box iterating, whether it's at the individual level or at the group or team level. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit in defense of time box iterations. And this is one of those things that sort of felt like I can't explain why this works for me, but I like it. And maybe it's just a personal preference, and maybe I should, sit back and not push so hard for it. But I think there's this interesting thing that happens. I've noticed this pattern where when you identify a missing good habit in your life, you go through a period where you use the habit more and more and try to use it sort of you try to be diligent, right? That disciplined, whatever you call it, where you try to use the habit all the time, and your performance increases for a while, and then eventually it's not that your performance levels off, but you start to have the feeling a little bit like, okay, I've spent the last couple of years developing this really strong discipline around this habit. The habit's been ingrained. I followed all of James Clear's Atomic Habits tricks now. I've internalized all that stuff. Everything's great. Now I trust myself not to do it all the time. And it's not just that I trust myself not to do it all the time. It doesn't mean I don't need the habit anymore. It means I trust myself more to notice when not following the habit is hurting me, and therefore to step it up. So now you sort of build this self-regulating system where my natural tendency is to do the habit less, but I have a way of noticing when my performance is deteriorating. Maybe mistakes are happening more often. Maybe I feel more anxious. Maybe I feel more stress. And and then I only have to follow one simple rule, which is when that signal happens, follow the habit more, like get more disciplined about the habit. And then naturally you'll get bored and a little bit more complacent, and then the habit will fall away a little bit. And over time, what happens is I trust myself to use the habit when I need it, and that when I cut corners, it's not a rookie mistake. I can get away with it more often. And I can get away with it more often in part because if I make a mistake, I know that my immediate impulse is to use the habit again. And I think time boxing works like that. I think that that especially if you use it, say, for example, Pomodoro technique or monotasking or any of those sort of personal work habits, working in 20, 30, 40-minute bursts and then taking a break, not just to rest, but to ask the question, should I switch tasks now? Is there anything else I need to be working on? Has anyone been waiting for me for the last 20 minutes? I think that in a rush to throw away time boxes as one of the things that we've, as an industry, outgrown, I think there are a lot of people who are at the tail of this curve that I'm talking about, where they can probably get away without time boxing because they did it so diligently for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And their first impulse when they get into trouble is to go back, is to grab their phone, set a timer for 30 minutes and sit down and do work. I don't do time boxed work all the time. But I know that if I get a sense that something I'm about to do is going to be stressful, if I feel like I don't like what I'm going to do next, or if I know that today's a day when I really need to be more responsive to the people around me, all the more reason why I need that time box so that I can remember every 20 minutes, every 30 minutes to pop up from what I'm doing, look around and see if anybody's waiting for me, use that as when I check email so that I can otherwise the rest of the time focus on what I'm doing. And that's the kind of thing that I think if I'm working solo, I have to use those kinds of habits in order to focus when I'm working and be responsive at the same time. In a way that if I'm working in a group, if there are 4 of us working on the same task, I can much more easily just check out for 10 minutes, check my email, then come back, get up and take a break and come back. I can let it flow more because I know that me stepping away for a few minutes doesn't mean that the group stops. If I'm working on my own, stepping away for 3 minutes means everything stops. Therefore, I think I need to be more systematic about when I choose to do it and why. Otherwise, I go back to the bad old days of alternating between being in a 2-hour trance and writing a bunch of crap and only by debugging it, noticing how bad it is, or at the first sign that it's a little bit annoying, flipping over to Twitter and reading it and then not realizing that I just now spent 25 minutes in some weird discussion on Twitter with somebody for no reason. Like I end up, if I'm not careful, then I end up swinging back between those two things. And I find that, fine, that happens every so often. And when it does, and I notice it, I go, ooh, okay, wake up, grab the phone, set the timer for 30. Well, first get up, grab coffee, come back. Set the timer for 30 minutes. Having ingrained that habit means that when I notice that I'm getting off the rails, my first impulse is to reach for that habit again. And I think that especially if you're not in a position to work in a group, if you have to work solo, you need to find out what those habits are for yourself that allow you to balance, focus on a task with being responsive to others. And I think that if you haven't gone through this part of the curve with time boxing, monotasking as a habit, I'm going to go out on a limb and say everybody in the world who has not gone through this would benefit going through this.
Yeah.
I don't have, the proof is too big to fit in the margins, but I'm pretty confident that it's true.
Yeah.
I've never had anyone email me and say, I wish you had never taught me this monotasking stuff. It was a total waste of time. That hasn't happened yet. That doesn't mean anything on its own. It's just that there might be something to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about it from, so you were talking a lot about like for a solo person and kind of the Pomodoro type stuff and the monotasking. And I think it still applies for someone pairing or mobbing, right? It's just,
question.
Yeah. It just looks differently. Right. And I think you're right that while their time boxes can be dangerous, right? So if for example, if management knows about the time box and they expect something by it, then it can turn into, I write more crap code because of the time box, right?
We're not looking to turn it into another micromanagement technique.
Yeah, sure. Exactly, right. But if it's more for just or me or just for my mob or just for my pair, and I really love how you talked about developing the habit and then throwing it away and bringing it back when you need it. You know what I mean? So I've noticed that, so while we don't work in sprints with like a time box, we do try to deliver something to production daily. And that is somewhat of a time box, right? And so
it's absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes we let that slip and it's okay. But then sometimes it's like, you know what, we're working in too big of a batch. We need to bring that back, kind of thing.
Right. If you've at least spent some time earnestly trying to deliver something daily or weekly, then it's much easier to let that go if it doesn't work. But if you've never gone through that part of the curve, then trying to jump to this part of the curve is dangerous, right? That just leads to sort of, well, I don't need to follow the rules. You need to follow the rules, but I don't need to follow the rules because I trust me. That's wonderful, but you're not the only one on the team here.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's the confusing part about it is that you latch on and like this becomes the rule forever on that we have this time box where it's kind of more like, it's almost like a shu-ha-re thing. You're like, you need it.
Absolutely.
And then you don't, and then you can toss it away and take it when you're back. And I think if it becomes a formal process, the ability to take it away and put it back is much harder, right? And so I think,
I'll say that I've been on mobs where team members will guilt other team members into taking a break. And so it's been a kind of an interesting thing because it ends up being like kind of like a forced piece of it where it ends up becoming a thing where it's like if the break is not taken, you should feel guilty for it. And so I've seen that happen, and it's kind of a
Please
fascinating.
let's not do that.
Yeah.
No, but that's the thing is that I think that it goes back to this thing again, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons to spend time taking those breaks is to remind yourself that it's okay to take a break.
Yeah.
That one of the benefits to taking a break is that you can be more deeply focused while you're working, which generally means fewer mistakes.
Yeah.
And that balances with, being responsive to other people. That ironically seeming, that deeper focus while you're working on something allows you to be more responsive to the people around you. Maybe not at the moment they want you, but on average, in 15 minutes, you can get an answer. And I think that there are a lot of people who haven't experienced that, and that I don't want to go to guilt, but if you and I agree that I'm going to make you stop because I know that you haven't experienced this yet, and I think you need to, and you agree that you need to. If you're delegating to me the authority to make you to tell you stop, and to actually, if it comes to that point, take the keyboard away from you, that's a voluntary choice. That's an agreement. That's not guilt. Where it goes to guilt, I think, is I'd like to think that the people who are laying that guilt on are doing it out of a sense of duty. Maybe it's just time to have a conversation about how to make that a voluntary agreement and not well-meaning manipulative coercion. And really the difference between those two things often lies in how well you trust the person doing it.
Well, and I think it just ended up being a conversation in a retrospective where it's like I feel guilty for not taking a break, and it feels really bad even though I really don't want to. And so that conversation had come up, and then it was good the day after. But so I've seen both sides. I've seen mobs go all day without a break, and people are asking around the business are asking, like, I didn't get my email answered ever. And then I've seen the opposite, where it's the there are people made uncomfortable, and like just falling on either side of that extreme, I think is really important to pay attention to. And
we had the same problem in the extreme programming community early on, that's when we started to change 40-hour weeks to sustainable pace, right? Because some people first of all, the Europeans said, 37 and a half, not 40. But a lot of people said, but I like working 60 hours a week. I mean, I would do this free of charge. Don't tell the employers that. But and that's when it became, don't spend time in the office, as a metaphor, when you don't want to be there. That sort of became the more trusting definition of sustainable pace. When really sustainable pace just means that, like, work at a pace that you can sustain indefinitely. And again, now you go back to the self-regulating system. So what are the signs that we're not sustaining it? What do we do to counteract that problem? And then we just sort of converge to a nice, happy medium over time and let it be as it is.
That's very healthy, I think.
No guilt is required in those situations. All you need is one rule to follow when the results stop being what you want. And that's it. And we can all agree to one rule. How hard can that be? In the case of that group not taking a break, I mean, I don't see any reason why we have to take a collective break. But if everybody feels confident and welcome to walk away and come back, if we notice that Austin has walked away for 30 minutes and not come back, then okay, maybe that's a conversation we need to have over lunch. But generally speaking, I want people to feel comfortable walking away and coming back and not having to orchestrate, hey, everyone, let's now take a break.
Both should be okay.
Exactly. I want it to be just let it be a proposal that the group makes. And then, hey, I need a break. Would anybody else like one? Sure. Okay. 4 out of 6 said yes. Do you two really want to keep working, or will you take a break with us too? Great. How hard is that?
And I think that's the good thing is, if you're kind of in this virtuous loop, whether you're pairing or mobbing, you work something out, right? You have your retrospectives, you have your learning about each other, and then you give each other feedback and you figure it out. Like, we're going to do formal breaks, or we're not, or some people are going to walk away. And with pairing and mobbing, it'll continue whether you're with them the whole time or not. I think it can be figured out. But I really admire the what you were saying about like we were saying before, to try things, you know what I mean? And so these break kind of systems can really help some people. So maybe worth a shot. So we are at time. So actually we're going to close out the show. Some great stuff. And we missed some topics, but that's fine. Maybe we'll do it again sometime later.
That sounds great.
Yep. Anything you'd like to plug or share before we close the show?
Absolutely. So we'll start with right on topic. So I am part of a new experience called pubmob.com. where I'll be leading some mob/ensemble programming in a variety of ways. There's a bunch of people. We have a number of session leads who are essentially doing whatever might be interesting to them or whatever might be interesting to the world, and gather together, and you spend a little money to mob with us, and maybe learn something. I'd like to learn a little pure script. I think that'd be kind of interesting, and do some good old fashioned boring refactoring of Java, which is a skill that a lot of people will probably still be able to make money with. And if that's not your thing, if you'd rather do something completely self-paced, then there's always tdd.training, and my other online course, Surviving Legacy Code. And I am available. Anyone who's looking for some one-on-one coaching, consulting, mentoring, whatever pairing, then it's less expensive than you might think. Check out experience.jbrains.ca.
Awesome.
Oh, and one more thing. Anyone who wants to ask me a question can always ask me at ask.jbrains.ca. As long as you're willing to wait indefinitely for the answer, that service is free. And if you need a better service level agreement, then we can talk about how much that costs.
Yeah. Sounds good. Sounds good. And thank you, Austin, for keeping us to our time box. I think that's JB, it was a pleasure talking to you. I wanted to kind of ask our audience, please, if you found that this information would be helpful for anybody that you know and you want to share it with them, please go ahead and share this with anybody else out there that you might know. And with that, I'll just say like, subscribe, and get the notifications, and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
All right. See you.